Okay, so get ready because this deep dive, we're going deep into the world of psychopathy. We're going to unpack all that research you sent over, tackle those headlines, those Hollywood stereotypes, really figure out, what makes these criminal minds tick.
And you know what? I think you'll find it's a lot more nuanced than just, labeling someone as evil. We're really talking about a specific personality disorder. It has its own characteristics, its own origins. It's complicated.
Yeah, it's like you were saying before we started recording. It's easy to get lost in the who and the what of a true crime story.
Yeah.
But you really pushed me to think about the why. With this research, you dug up all the academic studies.
Exactly. We have to go deeper than Silence of the Lambs. Don't get me wrong, those movies are captivating, but they don't always, reflect the reality that researchers are finding.
Totally. And that whole sensationalized view can be kind of dangerous, don't you think? Remember that case you sent me? The Muniver Karabulut murder in Turkey.
Oh, right.
It was huge, gripped the whole nation, and everyone just assumed that the murderer, Shem Garipolu, had to be legally insane.
Right.
Turns out he was declared sane, but with psychopathic traits.
Wow.
Talk about a real-world example of how complex this whole thing is.
And that case really highlights the difference between psychopathy and other conditions like antisocial personality disorder, APD. The public, they see a news story and lump everything together, but they're actually very distinct.
Okay, so for everyone listening, can we break that down? So both psychopathy and APD, they both involve this disregard for rules, other people's rights, but you're saying psychopathy goes deeper. How so?
So think of it this way. APD is more about the observable behavior. What someone does, the actions they take. Psychopathy, though, that digs into the emotional and cognitive aspects, the internal stuff driving those actions.
So someone with APD might commit a crime, but a psychopath would be more likely to do it without a shred of remorse.
Exactly, like their empathy switch is just flipped off.
It's like they know it's wrong, but they don't feel it.
And that brings us to the age-old question. Nature or nurture? Were they born this way, or did something make them this way?
Right, because it always comes back to that, doesn't it? Genes versus upbringing, the classic psychology debate. What's the verdict on psychopathy?
Well, research suggests it's not one or the other. It's this dangerous cocktail of both. There's a genetic component for sure. Studies show the heritability rate is somewhere between 40 to 50%, but that's just one piece of the puzzle.
So genetics loads the gun, environment pulls the trigger.
That's a powerful way to put it.
Whoa.
And there's a lot of evidence pointing to those really difficult childhood experiences. Abuse, neglect, harsh parenting as those environmental triggers. Imagine those things happening to someone already genetically predisposed to psychopathy.
It's a recipe for disaster.
Exactly.
Okay, that's pretty intense. So we've got this nature and nurture interplay happening, but it gets even wilder, right?
Yeah.
You were telling me about actual physical differences in the brains of psychopaths.
It's true. This is the really fascinating stuff. Brain imaging studies, they actually show us key differences, particularly in the connection between the amygdala, that's the emotional processing center of your brain.
Yep. And the orbitofrontal cortex, which handles decision-making, impulse control, that kind of thing.
Hold on. So if there's a disconnect between the part of the brain that processes emotions and the part that controls impulses,
yeah,
then you start to understand maybe why they don't think about consequences in the same way, why they struggle with empathy.
It's like their internal wiring is different. They might know something is wrong intellectually, but they don't feel it the same way.
That makes a lot of sense, but it also kind of raises another question. If someone's brain is wired that differently, how can you even begin to measure or diagnose something as complex as psychopathy?
That's where the Psychopathy Checklist Revised, the PCLR, comes in.
It's the most widely used tool that we have for assessing psychopathy, and it really dives deep into those internal characteristics we're talking about.
You're totally right to focus on the measurement question, because it's not like we can just, take their temperature or something.
Right.
The PCLR, this checklist, it's all about personality, not just what someone does outwardly.
Okay, so it's more than checking boxes. What kind of personality traits are we talking about, and how do they connect to those real-life cases we've been discussing?
Well, let's take the case of Criminal's Name that you found so interesting. Remember how they could charm their way into power, but then they'd exploit everyone around them?
Yeah.
That manipulative charm, that's a classic psychopathic trait. It's right there on the PCLR. It's like they wear this mask of normalcy, totally disarming. And it reminds me of those news articles about different criminals' name who bragged about their crimes. No remorse whatsoever.
Exactly. That lack of remorse, that lack of guilt or empathy is another big one on the PCLR.
It's so strange to imagine.
It helps us understand, at least try to, how someone can commit horrific acts and just not, be emotionally crippled by the guilt like you or I would feel.
It's chilling, really. It's like they understand they've done something wrong intellectually, but that emotional connection, that gut-wrenching feeling of remorse, it's just not there.
Right. They might as well be robots in a way, but they're not. That's what makes it so difficult. And remember that term we talked about before, semantic dementia?
Oh, right. The whole idea that they understand emotions on paper but don't actually feel them. Right.
Yes. Like they can read the words but not hear the music.
Exactly.
And that brings us to a huge question, maybe the biggest one. Why? Why do psychopaths act the way they do?
Right. Because if they're not driven by the same emotions as us, then what is fueling their actions? It's like trying to solve a puzzle, but half the pieces are missing and the other half doesn't quite fit.
That's a great comparison.
It's just, I don't know.
One theory we see in the research is that early experiences play a huge role. Take Jeffrey Dahmer, for example. I mean, your research mentioned his childhood fascination with anatomy, dissecting roadkill even.
Yeah, and how that behavior escalated from morbid curiosity to something much, much darker.
Exactly. Those early experiences, those formative years, they might hold some clues to the puzzle. Researchers theorize that Dahmer's early fascination with anatomy, possibly combined with other developmental and neuropsychiatric factors, might have contributed to his later crimes.
So you're saying his early interest in anatomy, which, for some kids might be totally normal, could have been an early indicator of something more sinister brewing beneath the surface.
Yeah, like a twisted seed that was planted early on and then took root.
That's a chilling thought, and it makes you wonder how those early experiences might shape their day-to-day life, their relationships, their behaviors, everything.
And that's what makes them so dangerous. Imagine a world where you're constantly seeking stimulation, but you're incapable of forming genuine bonds, have zero concern for the future.
Oh, wow.
That's the reality for a lot of psychopaths.
It's like they're playing a video game on God mode. Totally free from the consequences that shape our choices, the things that make us.
Exactly. And their actions, they often lack that emotional weight that grounds the rest of us. I was reading this fascinating example in one of the studies you sent. It talked about this hypothetical psychopath, Carl, who is in prison.
Okay, pretty standard so far.
Right, but here's where it gets wild. Carl asks his wife to visit and bring him cigarettes. Simple request, you'd think.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
Carl's wife explains that she couldn't find childcare. They're kids, so she couldn't make it. And Carl completely loses it, flies into a rage, threatens to kill her.
What? Over cigarettes? Are you serious?
It highlights how distorted their emotional responses are. A minor inconvenience for you or me is a life or death situation for Carl.
That is terrifying.
Their lack of empathy and their impulsivity, it's a dangerous cocktail.
It's not even just a lack of feeling. It's these unpredictable reactions to what most would consider pretty normal situations. It's like a ticking time bomb, and you just never know what's going to set it off.
And the scary part is, this pattern often starts early. A lot of psychopaths show behavioral red flags even in childhood. Lying, stealing, violence, cruelty to animals.
So the signs, they're there, but they're easy to miss, especially if you don't know what to look for.
You got it. And that's why understanding these nuances, these early indicators, is so crucial, especially when we start to talk about the differences between men and women who exhibit these traits.
That's actually something I wanted to ask you about, because you mentioned earlier that men tend to score higher on those psychopathy assessments, right? So does that mean they're more dangerous? Or just that it looks different in women?
It's a great question, and it's really important to remember that psychopathy isn't one size fits all, especially when you factor in gender.
Oh.
While both male and female psychopaths might share those core traits, that lack of empathy, the manipulativeness, how those traits actually manifest can be very, very different.
So while a male psychopath might be more prone to physical aggression, a female psychopath might use more like covert tactics to get what they want.
You're picking it up quickly. While men might be more physically aggressive, research shows women often use different strategies to achieve their goals. We're talking manipulation, deceit, and in some cases, even poison.
It's like they would rather use a scalpel than a sledgehammer. Subtle, but still incredibly dangerous.
And manipulation is key to how they operate. Remember those Black Widow cases you were talking about? Those women who, prey on partners or family members?
Yeah, talk about chilling. It's like something out of a horror movie, except it's real life.
And the motivations can be just as disturbing. While both genders might crave power or control, there's research suggesting that female psychopaths are often driven by things like jealousy or wanting to get rid of someone they see as an obstacle, or even just cold, hard cash.
It makes me think about that case, the one you sent me about Vera Renzi. She poisoned like over 30 men, her own husbands and sons, just because she was terrified of being abandoned.
A classic example of the Black Widow in action. And she's not alone, right? Remember Mary Ann Cotton from your research. Used arsenic to systematically eliminate, a string of husbands, her own mother, even some of her own children.
It's heartbreaking and horrifying all at the same time.
Yeah.
And it really challenges that stereotype of women being the gentler sex. I mean, these women were master manipulators, using whatever means necessary to get what they wanted.
Yeah, and it highlights that psychopathy isn't always about brute force or violence.
Right.
It's often about the calculated exploitation of other people, sometimes for years, without raising any suspicion.
I'm thinking back to that article you shared about John Grambling Jr., that con man who defrauded all those banks out of millions of dollars. He was living a lavish lifestyle off of other people's misery, and he was a master manipulator.
And that's a perfect example of how white-collar psychopaths exploit the system. They understand the rules, they understand human psychology, and they use it all to their advantage. It's chilling.
You know what? This deep dive has really opened my eyes. It's made me realize that psychopathy is so much more complex than most people realize. It's not just about Hannibal Lecter or Norman Bates. It's about everyday people who can seem charming one minute and then utterly ruthless the next.
And that's the thing, isn't it? They walk among us. They could be our neighbors, our colleagues, even family members. And that's why it's so important to educate ourselves, to recognize the signs, to really, be cautious about who we trust.
It's definitely given me a lot to think about. So much of what we've discussed, it challenges those preconceived notions we have about what a criminal looks like, how they act.
And the more we understand about the true nature of psychopathy, the better equipped we'll be to protect ourselves and maybe even prevent future tragedies. It's about being aware, being informed, and being vigilant.
Well said. This has been an incredibly insightful deep dive. I'm really glad we got to do this. Thank you so much for joining me today and for sharing all your expertise.
It was my pleasure. And remember, knowledge is power, especially when it comes to the darker side of human nature.
And for everyone listening, if this conversation sparked your curiosity, I really encourage you to check out the research we talked about today. Delve deeper into those cases, read more, keep asking those tough questions. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay safe.